Freedom of expression. A valid and effective Islamic version of human rights would not only serve the interests of Muslims but also might introduce a needed balance to the global human rights movement. The balance between freedom of expression and incitement, for example, is tilting dangerously towards license. If this is the general direction of the unlimited freedom of speech, then an Islamic view which places weight on responsibility and accountability for what one may say might be a cure. This is, of course, one of the more contentious issues, and it is driven a wedge between the liberals in the West and Islam. At heart, the dispute is about whether freedom of expression is absolute, a right which emanates from the dignity of human being and which should be restrained only in the extreme conditions, for example, war. This is certainly the position of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and one can follow its subsequent unfolding in modern liberal societies of the West. When Muslims and Muslim states are judged by these standards, they are seen to be wanting. Their response is usually expressed in the language of authoritarianism. The state or religion must not be undermined by irresponsible statements and declarations, but hardly ever in terms of their adherence to Islam's own understanding of freedom of expression. A return to first principles would help here. The roots of freedom of expression in Islam must be discovered and elaborated upon in a systematic and consistent manner. Such process would be connected to the contemporary definition of the phrase freedom of expression and not to one derived from the limited and possibly different meaning it had in earlier times. This ijtihad, independent reasoning to achieve valid juridical conclusions, must therefore be rigorous in scholarly terms as well as fully aware of the moral, political, and even metaphysical meanings attached to this particular freedom in modern times. Too often, the universal definition is taken for granted, and then reformers seek to find the justification for it posteriori in Islamic jurisprudence. The results are then hotly disputed among the more traditional scholars who reject them on the grounds of their being unacceptable innovations and pandering to the Western definitions. The alternative route is also fraught with problems. Traditional scholars draw on history, precedent, and analogy to interpolate the meaning of freedom and of expression and produce rigid and narrow definitions which do not fit with the modern broader significance of concept. The right of the human being to freedom of expression does not derive in Islam solely from the person's inherent dignity, which would entitle the man or the woman to this right. There is also the matter of purpose. What is the purpose of the right to free expression if that right does not seek to find or to advance the cause of truth? Islam would ask. The Quran is replete with references to haqq, the truth. And in fact, this is one of the attributes of God. The purposeful stance on the fully empowered being, is what stands at the heart of the freedom of expression. Of course, democratic ideas of freedom of expression were also imbued with the notion of truth. But this aspect of the matter has been whittled away over the past few decades. It is not that the freedom of expression is absolute in liberal democracies. It is not. There are specific legal limits, for instance, regarding the denial of Holocaust, which is considered a crime, or on malicious slander, but most of these have been removed as the definition of freedom of expression has expanded. The scope of obscenity charges, for example, has been drastically restricted in the past decades. However, non-legal constraints on the freedom of expression continue to hold, being prompted mainly by the public opinion determined to be the limits of freedom of expression. While in the past these limits may have been owed to a lot to the religious or moral scruples, Today, they are more influenced by the media and the opinion leaders in the society. Attacks on people on the grounds of race and ethnicity are deemed unacceptable and even criminalized in certain countries, but not attacks on grounds of religion. An individual is deemed to have chosen his or her religion, but not his or her ethnicity or race. The attacks on Islam have come from a variety of sources, but many we are, in one way or another, related to the issue of freedom of expression in Islam. The Rushdie affair, for example, in the end came down to a clash between the advocates of unrestricted freedom of expression and Islam's notion of blasphemy. Politically, of course, the Rushdie affair had far more to do with the disorientation and marginalization of recent migrants to the UK and with the intense, almost blind hatred which certain members of the West's intellectual elites have for Islam. The Rushdie affair was only the progenitor to a rash of similar confrontations which took place mainly in Western Europe between Muslims and the advocates of absolute free expression. The Danish cartoon controversy and the murder of the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh simply confirmed to the West the censorious and repressive features of Islam. Muslims, of course, saw it differently as a calculated, gratuitous attack on the faith of a deeply disadvantaged and politically weak minority, and an attack designed to humiliate and incite. There is probably little common ground between absolute freedom of expression and desirable limits of free expression in Islam. Political correctness in the West world plays a decisive role in limiting the freedom of expression among the intelligentsia. It is partly born out of guilt about the horrors of Holocaust, which were mainly ignored or acquiesced to by a substantial number of people, including intellectuals, during the 1930s and in wartime Europe, and guilt about the undercurrent of racism, which was part and parcel of colonial projects. The extent of awareness and complicity of Europeans, both in the Western and Eastern Europe, the decimation of their Jewish and Gypsy co-citizens during the Second World War has only recently come to light. In most of the Western world, Holocaust denial and overt racism have become criminalized and anti-Semitism is no longer publicly tolerated in any form. But this sentiment does not quite apply to Islam. For example, a bill proposed by the British government in 2004, which intended to criminalize incitement to religious hatred and was mainly aimed at preventing Islamophobic behavior, was watered down and finally dropped. It faced a chorus of protests from across the whole political spectrum, most of them couched in convoluted arguments about why freedom of speech should not be constrained by religious sensibilities. It was clear that the attempt to give Muslims in Britain some legal cover against violent acts or speech which targeted them as Muslims had no appeal, especially for opinion leaders, politicians, and intellectuals. Freedom of speech is, in fact, constrained in many instances to the West, but Muslims see the insistence on an absolute right to freedom of speech on the part of those who target them or their faith. Islam not only respects but also demands freedom of expression. The Quranic injunction to enjoin the good and shun the evil is impossible to act upon if the human beings are not allowed to speak and act freely. But the concept of Hisbah, which embodies this injunction, has been perverted over time. It is now associated with the notorious moral police of some Muslim countries who take it upon themselves to ensure that Muslims conform to the supposedly Sharia-ordained outer norms of conduct, such as ensuring that couples who appear together in public are related or legally married, or that women are wearing the appropriate articles of clothing. In an erudite and comprehensive work, Freedom of Expression in Islam, the Afghan scholar Muhammad Hashim Kamali sets out specific principles from which an entire doctrine of free speech can be derived. These principles are derived from the fact that many actions which are deemed praiseworthy in Islam can only be overtaken if one has the ability to express oneself freely. These include the proffering of sincere advice, nasiha, the need to consult, shura, personal reasoning, the freedom to criticize, the freedom to express an opinion, and the freedom of association and the freedom of religion. These rights are not absolute, they are constrained both morally and legally. The moral constraints on freedom of expression are found in all great religions. They are built in safeguards that prevent injustice, abuse, and strife. Backbiting, slander, ridicule, and exposing the weaknesses of others are all exhortations that carry no legal but only a moral compunction. The arts of comedy or satire might suffer if such compunctions are carried to extremes, but Islam would not specifically restrict them. Islamic literature is full of irreverent and satirical poets who caricatured the rulers and the high and mighty. Some, in fact, carried their license into dangerous territory. The blind medieval poet Abul Ala al-Mari, for example, went so far as to denounce religion and all that was sacred in Islam. The Hajj was a pagan institution. The religion, including Islam, was for knaves and fools. Do not suppose the statements of the prophets to be true. They are all fabrication. Men lived comfortably till they came and spoiled life. The sacred books are only such a set of idle tales as any age could have and indeed did actually produce, he wrote. Elsewhere, Al-Mari declared, falsehood has corrupted all the world, that wrangling sects each other's gospel chide, but where not hate man's natural element. Churches and mosques had risen side by side. He even challenged the literary merit of Quran by claiming he would equal it in poetry. But although he indeed produced a parody of Quran, he did admit to its literary inferiority. Mari was not a hermit or a recluse, so that his rank impieties and heresies would not have gone unnoticed. He lived to be 84, and according to the traveler and fellow poet Nasiri Khusro, who visited him at his hometown, he was very rich, revered by the townsfolk, and had over 200 students who came to attend his lectures on literature and poetry. What Al-Mari and scores of other libertines and free thinkers in Islam had done was to exercise their freedom of opinion unrestrained by any moral compunction or special fealty to Islam. They were not punished as their contemporaries in medieval Christianity would certainly have been, nor were they socially censored or ostracized. Personal unbelief and even mockery of the faith may have been reprehensible, but formed an insufficient basis to condemn and punish the violators. However, there are specific instances where the Sharia calls for legal restraint, and in this sense, it can be said to limit the freedom of expression. These restraints, for instance, malicious slander or libel, would be recognizable in modern Western societies. Others, such as blasphemy, are holdovers of laws on the statute books in some Western countries and are not enforced in the present time. Speech or action which encourages fitna, sedition, and conspiracy against legally constituted authority is punishable offense. It would be no different from sanctioning those who conspire to overturn or undermine the legal order of any democratic state. The modern Muslim state has ignored the wide latitude given in Islam to exercise the freedom of expression, but this is more to do with the structures of authoritarian states and governments than with Islam as such. Most of these governments attained power in ways which the Sharia would condemn. military coup or assassinations and killings. Most of the world sees Muslims and Muslim rulers who flagrantly violate universal standards of human rights and freedoms, but does not pause to consider whether these violations are in any way allowed or tolerated in Islam. It is automatically assumed that because they are perpetrated by Muslims, they must have the same sanction of the religion in whose names these violations are often committed or justified. But those who denigrate Islam's commitment to freedom of expression appear to have a strong case in a very special and limited issue of the Islamic position on apostasy and blasphemy. This is typical of the clash between the values of a secular modernity and a religiously inspired world, one which has been relegated to the past in most liberal democracies. That blasphemy and apostasy can be considered to be crimes is astonishing to most secular minded people. India itself smacks of heretics burnt at the stake and of massacres of innocents in religious wars, a past which is best transcended rather than relived. However, the easy generalizations about Islam and its attitude towards blasphemy and apostasy are not born out of either a history or by law. Although all major classical Islamic schools of jurisprudence agree that the death sentence should be prescribed for both blasphemy and apostasy, there is a significant growing body of discerning opinion on this matter. The dissenters base their argument inner aliyah on the explicit Quranic verse stating that there is no compunction in matters of religion. In the early community of Muslims, the acts of blasphemy and apostasy had clear political and religious implication. The nearest approximation to these provisions in modern times would be high treason. As the nascent community of Muslims became established, so did its confidence in its survival and growth. Islamic history presents only a few instances where people were tried and put to a death specifically for these crimes. The scale of these incidents pale to that of European wars of religion, where tens and thousands were put to death for their beliefs. The rarity of these crimes in Islam may be put down either to fear of retributive justice or to the fact that legal authorities preferred to overlook such crimes, probably because of a general unwillingness to acknowledge that they merited the death sentence or that they threatened the integrity of Islamic society. In modern times, the issue of blasphemy or apostasy hardly ever materializes in the Islamic world, and when it does, it is often sensationalized by the Western media and treated as a significant issue in Muslim society. It does not occur to Islam's critics that the vast majority of Muslims may not be particularly interested in changing their religion or in deriding its tenets and its prophet. A basically theoretical concern about the barbarism of Islam's apostasy and blasphemy laws has been transposed as a defining feature of the civilization. The resources and power of parts of the media in the West and their deliberate targeting of Islam and Muslims frequently overpower any attempt to provide a balanced perspective on the matter. Punishments for blasphemy and apostasy are lumped together with child brides, women in burqas, the stoning of adulterers, the flogging of wine drinkers, and the execution of homosexuals to generate a ghastly and frightening image of Islam. It may sell newspapers and bring audiences to TV channels, but it hardly serves the purpose of truth. On balance, equality, and justice. The issues related to the rights and values that are facing Islamic civilization are real enough, but they cannot be treated one dimensionally. It is not enough to capitulate to the incessant calls for the implementation of universal rights, neither is it possible to hide behind an all too human rendering of the Sharia and claim eternal validity for its rulings. The middle ground, if there is one, between an aggressive universalism and the defensive Parochialism is also an inadequate end result for what, after all, is a set of existential questions. These go to the heart of what Islam means and its relationship to the ideas of justice and equality. Whenever such issues are raised, the proper course is to return to the first principles. For example, the landmark decisions of the US Supreme Court in the 1950s and the 1960s on civil rights drew on basic concepts such as equal protection in order to overturn 2 centuries of racist and discriminatory legislation. Many of these formal laws had been approved by the Supreme Court itself in earlier times. The continuation in the statute books of such a racist and discriminatory legislation threatened to poison the politics of the US and even to destroy its foundations of democracy and the equality of its citizens under law. The crisis in Islamic civilization is broader. It is not restricted to one or two glaring aspects of abuse that need to be overturned or addressed. There is no single authority which could do the overturning. In fact, there are numerous authorities, some of them self appointed, which claim the right to interpret Islam. This process is incremental and may go on for decades before a new paradigm is established to which most Muslims would subscribe for most of the time. There are numerous passages in Quran which discuss the matter of the median way, the balance and scale of things. Balance is one of the defining features of Islam. Balance between the individual and the collective, between the physical and spiritual, between the private and the public domain, between men and women, between rights and duties. Whether Muslims like it or not, the balance inside Islam has been ruptured and civilization has lost its poise. Retreat into a self enclosed space is not an option. An ever changing world is too demanding and intrusive to allow this. The values of modern societies are a constant challenge and refrain to Islam, and their main demands have seeped into the public consciousness of Muslims. They have to determine whether the values in question are instrumental to the enhancement of justice and the possibility of living the good life. Muslims also have to determine whether these rights are derivable from the Islamic legacy itself and at the cost of what modification and change. Women's rights, for example, is an issue that will be explained away by reference to the fact that Islam honored women in Arabia in the 7th century, that women's rights are enshrined in the Quran, or that women dominate the private space in Islamic life. All these facts are true, but they bear little relation to the real condition of women in Muslim societies and the raw deal they receive under the camouflage of Sharia. Seeking a balance in the male female relationships in Islam requires not only the re examination of the roots of inequality, but also a redefinition of the role of men according to Quran and Sharia. Balance is not a compromise between inequality and equality, but a separate state which strives for a harmonious justice and stable outcome. In the case of women's right, not only the women are to observe modesty and courtesy in their outer behavior and inner disposition, men are also obliged to do the same. Muslim societies are mainly patriarchal, often reflecting historical tribal values which privilege males over females. These values have persisted into modern times so that the Quranic standards of conduct demanded of men, especially in terms of fairness to women, are often ignored or flaunted in practice. Women's rights in Islam cannot be enhanced without a parallel insistence that men must also adhere to the Quranic injunctions concerning their behavior and conduct. In the end, Muslims must themselves decide what human rights mean in Islam, and whether these rights must be affirmed consciously rather than adopted under pressure or international scrutiny. However, the starting point must be whether Muslims actually want these rights for themselves, not only because they are sanctioned by jurisprudence, but, and perhaps more importantly, because they promote justice. The concept of adl, justice, is specifically mentioned in many instances in the Quran. Justice in Islam is a universal moral truth and the creation of a just order, political as well as religious, ought to be a primary focus of any Islamic rule or government. The fact is that Muslim states pay scant attention to Quranic justice and have not developed any body of human rights principles which are based on justice. But the establishment of a more just society may, in fact, be the way forward for an evolving Islamic doctrine of human rights. The inequality of women in society, for example, violates the concept of adl in many fundamental ways. Adl can be used to reinterpret or challenge important rulings which have determined the Islamic position on these matters, creating a new Islamic architecture of human rights. Regardless of whether these rights accord to the rules of international conventions, it is crucial they occupy a prominent place in the political and moral lives of Muslim societies.